NWA released a song titled Fuck the Police, and it still might be the most subversive, radical, and controversial song in hip-hop history.
Yo, Dre, what up? I got something to say.
Fuck the police, coming straight from the underground.
Which is funny because over time, the members of NWA proved to not be all that radical. But what they were at that time was provocative. They knew how to rile people up, and they knew what they were talking about. It was true.
Hey, dusting off my shit like gonna. Hey, dusting off my like Craig gonna. Yeah, dusting off my shit like Craig gonna. Hey, this is extortion, nigga. Okay. Shit. Yeah, okay. Keep that bingo on.
So you can't see it right now. You can't see it at all, actually. But right across from where I'm sitting is a big-ass jail.
Brad, thank you. Channel 2 investigates possible prison corruption here in Atlanta. Today, whistleblowers testified on Capitol Hill about major security and safety problems at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary.
It's a really huge, ominous building, and it's right in the middle of the city. It's in the middle of a regentrifying part of the city. Right across from this jail, they're building luxury townhomes. And this little section, this little area of street art is actually a popular place for people to film videos. There was a viral Divine 9 video filmed here a couple of years back. This is, one thing about Atlanta is that it embraces street art. And so you have like this mural, you have luxury townhomes, you have some really nice eateries and restaurants not too far from here. You got gentrifying neighborhoods going this way, and in the middle of all of that is a big-ass federal prison. And I can't show it to you because I'm pretty sure filming a prison is illegal, and considering the nature of this video, niggas not taking no chances.
Problems here for years. Well, today, a Senate subcommittee in Washington, D.C. paints a picture of prisoners running the show here at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, and prison officials doing little to stop the corruption.
The would-be dangerous criminals in this facility for years would often escape the prison to go get Taco Bell or see their girlfriends and then return back to the prison through numerous holes in the prison's gates, like teenagers sneaking in and out of their house after curfew to go hang with their friends.
Federal prosecutors say he snuck out of the Atlanta pen at least 3 times to see a girlfriend, then sneaking back each time. This confirms an ongoing problem at the prison where inmates are able to escape easily, and there is seemingly very little the guards can do about it.
The prison was so poorly run that just a few years ago, its population was reduced to less than 150 prisoners in this huge building, just so the federal government could clean house in the prison's leadership and administration. The entire thing is an absolute farce. But to the layman that missed the news coverage, that doesn't know anything about how prisons work, they might just pass by it. When I drive past this prison with my kids, they often ask, "Daddy, what is that building?" When I told them it was a prison, they responded with something along the lines of, "Oh, so there's bad guys in there." To which I answered, "No, son, not really." As you can imagine, as much as possible, I try to impart a lot of knowledge to my children. If you ask my son about the British, he's probably going to say something about the ravages of colonialism. I am bringing them up right. This is to counteract a lot of myth-making that is ingrained in the education systems and media that our children consume.
I'm gonna make the world a better place.
But even in doing that, it's a bit harder to perfectly explain the messed up nature of crime, justice, and prisons to a child. And it doesn't help that these children are already developing a perspective of what America's justice system is based on common opinions about them that they see on TV.
Cops, central organization of police specialists, fighting crime in a future time, protecting Empire City from Big Boss and his gang of crooks.
So much of our culture is shaped by ideologies that look at issues of justice simplistically. Things are either right or wrong, good or bad, legal or illegal.
Sometimes it seems laws are made to keep us from what we want to.
On the contrary, Kent, it's law that allows us to live in freedom, real freedom.
Common opinion says that people that do wrong things deserve punishment, and punishment is always good if it fits the crime. This is a core feature in our society. It is in my son's school environment. Hell, it's even to an extent in our home environment. Everything from Batman to Paw Patrol contribute to a message about crime and policing and justice in ways that hide the reality of how those systems actually work. The concept of crime and punishment is incredibly complex, yet the average person who has minimal connection to it looks at it with no more complexity than my 10-year-old son. And that's a problem. Because as we look at the nature of crime, justice, and prisons, we see not just human atrocities and injustice being done to people with little to no regard, but we also see a core aspect of systemic oppression operating in plain sight with almost everyone's approval and consent. So today I want to contribute to fixing that. I'm going to bite off some really small chunks of this issue and present it to you not as the end-all be-all solution or explanation of what's wrong with police and prisons, but as a primer on why all of us need to be looking at prisons with the concept of justice differently. And to help that, as I often do, I got the support of actual experts with a variety of angles and knowledge on the subject.
I think why people want these simple answers a lot of times is because it's easier versus having to actually do the work and work through the trauma and the harm that happens within our communities.
This is the only place where the only person I can demonstrate this level of authority with. People often do that with kids, and kids are robbed of their personhood. So when you add the level to that of the fact that we are already ingrained and indoctrinated in our society to carceral and punishment and all these things are so tied together, it makes natural sense to us. And in fairness to us, it's not that we use the police or violence or any of these other things in a way that others don't. It's just the consequences of when we do it, right? Because white people can call the police all the time.
The thing to remember is that even without the media or like propaganda, that's going on, right? We are kind of like, even if you never turned on a TV, you never saw any movies, which like obviously is not a thing. But even if you did that, that's kind of how our society is set up. Well, like there has to be this level of buy-in with the police where we just assume that they're good, because if we don't, that's like horrific. And now all of a sudden we have to do like all of this like recontextualizing over everything. I think that it is just a lot easier and people are a lot more willing to buy into the system and just have stuff that reaffirms that the system that they live in is good, that they live in a just world. And this is something that makes TV and film and the cops like a perfect marriage.
Prison abolition started in prisons. I just want that to start. And I don't want to say that even on some corny, like, oh, we got to center the most marginalized. No, like it started in prisons for a reason, because they were developing their own intellectual thought. So we should see prisoners who were engaged in abolition or engaged in others, organizing against prisons as intellectuals, as thinking people, not just as props for our whatever we trying to do, and by developing in prison, it had a much more revolutionary tinge to it than what it's become since it's been popular since like 2020 or whatever.
Historically, Black folks have always had issues with cops, going back to the first form of policing being slave overseers and eventually slave bounty hunters. But still, never has our feeling on a relationship between the police and Black people, or hell, all the people, really been more effectively communicated. I mean, it's a reason you never heard a single rapper yelling, "All cops are bastards." Pretty sure most Black people don't even know what ACAB is unless a liberal come and explains it.
He has time now to think about what he's done. And I believe he'll turn out all right.
So before getting into the heavier explicit details about these things and the core arguments and the research and the haymakers about police and the courts, etc., first we got to hold up a mirror. Because I have one overall goal, which is for everyone that watched this video to become a supporter of ending policing as we know it and abolishing all prisons. But to really do that, the first thing we have to recognize is that the biggest asset the police and these systems have is our consent and faith in them as institutions. Even folks that know firsthand how trash these systems are will think that it's going too far to say we're going to abolish prisons. The idea of having no justice system, no law and order, that's ridiculous and even dangerous. We need the police to protect and serve, and we need prisons to put away dangerous people so that they can't hurt anyone.
abolishing the NYPD. That'd be suicide.
But yes, they're needed. I push for them to be here.
There's too many criminals out here, man. Are you kidding me? I wouldn't feel safe.
So we need control of the city. So I think the police are necessary.
We'll get to most of that bullshit a little later. I'm not saying that we won't ever need a form of community level security, or that crime will never happen in a world with no police, or that we won't have to figure out what to do about said crime and, more importantly, victims of crime. Nobody who is serious about abolition believes these things. But I do want to challenge why we fear this mythical, lawless reality so much in the first place, and why we think the police in our current court system is responsible for the level of safety or justice we currently have. I want you watching this right now to consider just how much actual experience you have with the police and the criminal justice system. Because of the way the algorithm works and what I know about my audience, the chances are if you're watching this video on YouTube, you are watching as a person of relative privilege, probably a relatively decent level of education, which means you probably have not had much engagement with the criminal justice system at any level. If you're Black, there's a higher likelihood you've been profiled by police before, pulled over, maybe even detained. But have you ever been arrested? Have you ever been convicted? Do you have people in your family or close to you that have done time? Have you seen the long-term effects of prison on those individuals when they finally come home? Have you ever been victim of a crime and realized how difficult it is to actually get justice? Ever experienced the overall indifference of the police to your well-being after you've called them to come protect and serve?
A number of victims who report a sexual assault are treated insensitively, are not believed, are blamed for their assaults, and are traumatized by their experience with police.
I started to feel like a victim because of my interactions with the police. They didn't believe me. They made me feel ashamed for questioning them. They made me feel like I was making something up.
Have you ever been systematized or even been in court custody or had a child in defects? I ask these questions because if you're watching this, it's highly likely you have little to no experience with these things.
He's now aging out of Georgia's foster care. Christian considers it a legal system that failed him. But the chaos from moving to foster home to one day this year, somewhere truly unexpected. This Department of Family and Children's Services office is where he was living.
It didn't make sense to me why this was happening to me. When I came in, I saw a lot of blankets on the floor, a lot of things on the floor. There was not a lot of food in there.
DFACS, the agency tasked with protecting kids, housed foster youth in its county offices for months on end.
We're staying here because they don't have nowhere for us to go.
The majority of us who lend power to the system don't really know what this system feels like in real life.
I think when we are passively consuming escapist content over and over again, it tends to become our main contact point, especially for like white people or people who don't have a lot of interaction with the police. The main way you interact with the police is through these cop shows. That is their main contact point. So like they think about the police, they think about crime, and they're like, well, I saw this on Law and Order once. And you know, that might not be realistic, but that's like what I got.
Going back to my sons, they're lucky enough that their main engagement with the police are from security officers in their schools. And they're all Black men with smiling faces and gentle, strong demeanors. And I wave hi and talk to them every day as I drop my boys off. And that's the natural cognitive dissonance that you might have toward individual police officers and the societal role that they inhabit. And I'm not saying that that cognitive dissonance needs to go away and that you have to see all police officers as demons. And most people don't feel that way. But most people also don't have to engage with the full reality of the system, and they think that police only exist in this positive, helpful space that we are lucky to experience depending on the background and privilege that you have right now. When people get money, much like in Ice Cube, they tend to have a very different perspective on how the police treat people. Ice Cube started out as fuck the police, and now he's doing interviews with Tucker Carlson talking about bootstrap politics because Ice Cube is now a very rich man. And the person he was when he made that song is a very different person than who he is now.
If you are a person who is not regularly interacting with crime or poverty, then every time you see a dark street, a dark alley or something, you're seeing it on TV.
304, 1031 on foot. Westbound on Baden.
And that means something awful is probably happening in that alley, which means that even if most alleys are fine, every time you see one, you are scared of it because the only thing you've ever seen happen in them is like murder. You tend to like fear things like that. I've recognized this with like my extended family. Like they're scared of cities because that's where the crime is. Because that's the only time that they ever see cities is on TV and these cop shows.
When we talk about prison abolition, we talk about trying to actually address the problems that are really inside our community. You know, we started to think about transformative justice and how to deal with conflicts and harm that is done within the community, because a lot of people think of crimes, they're thinking of harm, right? Because most crimes, let's be real, aren't really about harm. Like, for example, a lot of people are arrested for drug crimes, which isn't about like you harming someone. Nobody's going out to harm somebody when they're using drugs. Nobody's going out to harm somebody even when they're selling drugs. Now, you could argue that people using drugs are harming themselves and then selling people is whatever, like adds to that. But that also, I would argue, generally, people are using drugs because of the trauma that they have faced in their community that already is existing from all the way back to slavery. It's just passing down this trauma over and over again, and getting reinforced by the system itself.
I think the first thing that people need to understand about abolition, and I always put it this way, is that abolition is a vision for the future. You know, it is abolitionists are aware. We are aware of the fact that they're not going to just, open up all the prisons and close the courts and get rid of all the police tomorrow or today. And we recognize that we also don't have the infrastructures in place to do that, right? The idea is that investing in criminalization of people and putting more money and resources into under-resourced communities and people so that you could police them and incarcerate them and saddle them with debts and criminal records and all of these things don't actually address crime. This isn't just about, that I just care about the criminals, which is a whole nother conversation, but it's about caring about yourself and trying to stop crime and recognizing that, well, a system that has created a profit system on incarcerating people it literally is in the business of regurgitating and repeating that because that's what keeps the system running.
When you say abolish prisons, the question that people will usually bring to you is, what about the rapists and murderers? What about the abusers and the sexual predators and all the people that we tend to think police and jails protect us from? Again, ask yourself how much you know about these situations. Most sexual assaults are never even prosecuted, and most murders are never solved by a wide margin. Worse yet, many sexual assaults that result in arrest never go to trial. I'm sure many of us remember Brock Turner from a few years ago. That situation where this person was convicted of rape and did not see any jail time is not as rare as you think. According to one study, less than 60% of convicted sex offenders ever spend time in a prison. One study in Idaho tracking Pedialyte drinkers found that only 28% of those convicted of child sexual assault actually went to jail. We are already living in the world that people are telling us to fear without the police. So why are we so invested in this myth that it does work? Why is it so important for us to see those who really suffer under the system as deserving of that suffering if it means that this myth can be maintained? There's a lot of answers as to why that's the case. I could fill up 5 more videos, but for the sake of time, we're going to focus on one major factor, which is how we view crime and criminals in this country, and conversely, how we view the police, and how these views make the horrors of this system seem justified, maybe even normal. So let's go back in time. Coming out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and the Supreme Court era of the 70s, relatively significant actions were taken to address racism in the United States. However, these actions were almost always met with overt resentment and resistance from white Americans.
It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
And the result from the 1970s going forward was nearly 40 years of Republican-dominated governments in America, often elected using Southern strategies popularized by Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater. The Southern strategy, for those who do not know, was basically using the fear of black anything to rile up voters and get them to vote and empower Democrats who would eventually become modern-day Republicans.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
People often think the culture wars that we're dealing with online all the time today are new, but they're really not. There's always been racial and gender divides that have always bled into or often stemmed from political divides. And they almost always are between a dominant group fighting to keep a subordinate group from making progress. It's often seen as deserving versus undeserving, but what it really is meant to be is white versus black, or rich versus poor. That said, in this time period, it wasn't hard to entrench a negative public sentiment toward inner city urban areas as Americans witnessed urban decay that had never been seen before, a result of generations of disinvestment and economic and social exploitation of black and brown people in places like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Baltimore, etc. And this image of black and brown people tearing each other apart in the inner cities was the status quo of the time for that entire time. But a change of sorts came in the early 90s when Bill Clinton became the first Democratic president in 12 years and one of only 2 Democrats to be the president in almost a 40-year period. And this happened because Clinton led a rightward shift in Democratic policies, promising to address crime and cult welfare. And with some help from third-party spoiler Ross Perot, Clinton beat incumbent George Bush Sr. to become president in 1992.
Congratulations.
2 years later, Clinton would make good on his promise to address crime, which culminated in the 1994 crime bill, guided by his wife and future senator/presidential candidate Hillary Clinton and current president and former vice president Joe Biden.
It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
The crime bill has been talked about a ton in the last decade or so as the disastrous results of it have now really become impossible not to notice. Policymakers at that time leaned into tough on crime ideology as opposed to the more obvious and also well-known research around social and community development to address crime. The bill made little to no investment into the poor by design urban centers of America that I spoke about earlier. Instead of investment in those cities, millions were spent on funding the police, expanding federal prisons, and fighting the war on drugs. Policies were instituted for mandatory minimum sentences, 3-strike rules, and countless other new reasons to put predominantly poor people and disproportionately black people in prison. One of the most notable elements being the violent offender incarceration and truth in sentencing incentive grant program, which gave out $12.5 billion in grant money, not for education, healthcare, housing, or community investment, but for building prisons to house all the newly incarcerated. And it worked in a multitude of ways. It's fair to say that the crime bill reduced crime, although it's also fair to say that crime was reducing beforehand.
And the thing that is always striking to me, and I think really underplayed in our national discourse over crime, is that we don't really understand it. If you go into the 80s and the 90s, you see crime goes way, way up in the 70s, way, way up in all kinds of different jurisdictions, more or less all at the same time. And then it begins going way, way down in all kinds of different places all at the same time. So you have stories that people know, like there's New York with Rudy Giuliani and broken windows policing and stop and frisk. But it also goes down in all these places that didn't do what New York City did. It's so widespread, both the rise and the fall, that you end up having researchers trying to think of even broader explanations, like whether or not lead and the amount of lead in young kids' bloodstream and thus the effect on their executive function when they got older, maybe that's the causal mechanism.
And it's definitely more fair to say that the bill greatly increased mass incarceration, which had also been spiking since the Reagan era. Now, since the 2010s, statistically, incarceration has been lessening as people realizing the problems of this bill have started to make changes to undermine its damages. But understand, the damage had already been done. I bring all of this up because we often look at the failure of this bill as something that happened to the black community from white political forces. And while this is overall true, it's not a useful or fair critique of what actually happened. A more accurate critique requires us to engage with the fact that a lot of black people, many who were directly suffering under an epidemic of crime and drugs, were on board with this bill from day one.
Let me start out with this. I am ashamed of my vote. I sincerely apologize to my God, apologize to my community, to my family. That was the worst vote, as I look back over the years, that I've taken since I've been in the Congress.
And that brings me back to the question of the first section. Why were black people so willing to see carceral punishment as a fix to societal problems of crime? The 1994 crime bill was endorsed by the Congressional Black Caucus, and it was supported by black Democratic leaders like the only black senator at the time, Carol Moseley Braun.
I could cite statistics such as these regarding the level of violent crime in our society for the rest of this evening, but the numbers only serve to illustrate what we already know. I believe that the federal government must act to help take back our streets, to ensure that every man, woman, and child in this country feels safe in their communities, in their schools, and in their homes. And that is why it is imperative that Congress send this bill to the president as soon.
Or the current so-called kingmaker, Jim Clyburn.
But people say that, it at least perpetuated the idea that more people should be imprisoned. Do you ever think about that your support for this bill may have perpetuated mass incarceration as we see it now?
Yeah, I think about that. I just don't think that's true.
And this is not to say that other black Democrats like the late great John Lewis or Maxine Waters didn't oppose the bill as a whole.
We know the best way of effectively reducing crime lies in addressing the root causes of crime. Unfortunately, there is no issue we face where the difference between responsible governing and political popularity is so great. In the politics of crime, the right thing and the politically popular thing are total opposites. The best politics of crime involves the emotional appeal, mandatory minimum sentences, life without parole, no rehabilitation, more death penalty provisions, and put them to death quicker by cutting out the appeals. That strategy appeals to emotion and helps politicians get elected, but it does nothing to reduce crime in the streets.
But they were still responding to pressure from regular black people in the crosshairs of these problems to do something, anything about the crime in these communities. There were plenty of black people asking for community investment and deterrence programs and fighting against three-strike rules and mandatory minimums. But overall, a lot of black folks seem to think that the police would easily be able to tell the good black folks from the bad, and that the deserving would benefit and that the undeserving would suffer.
Question of additional police officers. If we hired the right police officers and if they did the right thing, would that have an impact on the crime rate?
I doubt it. As I said before, even if you hire the right police officers and they're doing the right thing all the time, what are you going to do with them? They're going to be walking all over top of each other. In this country, I think we're down. Those numbers are even greater. When there was a time 20 years ago when my department had 8,500 police officers. We're now down to 6,200 police officers. The crime rate was higher then than it is now. And those bear the national statistics. So it's not the number of police officers that you have, it's the job that they perform.
Who remembers a few years ago the awful social media trend of black parents embarrassing their children on Facebook by cutting their hair in ridiculous ways and sending them to school and videotaping the whole thing, or showing up to the school to berate and beat them in front of the world? Who has joked about experiences getting whipped by parents and grandparents? I think it's impossible to deny that the concept of carcerality is low-key a little deep in black culture. And it may start out as, older black folks telling kids to pull their pants up, but it lends itself to a multitude of black people endorsing a corrupt prison system, maybe to prove that they are one of the good ones. I worked with parents and troubled youth a lot over the course of my pre-YouTube career. And one thing that you'll always hear from a parent whose kid is in trouble is how they did everything they were supposed to do to keep their child out of trouble. In fact, they sometimes overpresent these ideas, the fact that they were whipping their child and taking away their child's stuff and embarrassing their child. And you kind of want to tell them, maybe not in the moment, that that's probably part of the problem.
You're going to lose your child's trust, possibly for life. You know what I mean? Like, I remember when I woke up with police surrounding my bed, bro. Like that, My grandma did a lot of effed up stuff after that too, so it just got worse. But like that had like shattered trust from that point. And then I think not far after when I started standing up and not letting her beat me anymore. I was like, no, you ain't gonna beat me anymore. I'm good. Like, because even though she beat me my whole life, I still had trust and faith in her till that moment.
Very oftentimes when my clients talk to me, I always try to tell people when I meet my client, this is not the first system to fail them. You know what I mean? By virtue of me as a public defender representing them, which is who the majority is represented by in the criminal system, you are literally impoverished. You're disenfranchised in some way. You've already experienced some kind of institutional letdown. And I've never been that. I've never walked through this. Like, all of those things are a culmination of how you end up to be, how you end up with your choices, how all those things. Like, imagine in your teenage years, I am about to be 30 next month. The things, the anxieties, the depressions, whatever issues that I had as a teenage are the things that have grown, manifested, worked through, whatever, in all this time. So imagine your teen years, your first brush with depression, someone dies, and that somehow becomes your mother criminalizes you. Where does that trickle? Right. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so by the time you do something that you commit some crime that people won't consider a crime of poverty or whatever, because they don't think of the chain. They don't think of the entire chain and how all these things.
And that's the point of this whole section, is to dig through the tough reality that while we suffer under the systems, we are still very deeply invested in them, down to how we raise our children. And I want to blame it on the legacy of our treatment during and post-slavery. I want to blame it on internalized anti-blackness. I'm sure there's several good books that explain exactly how this stems out from that behavior for whatever reason. But if we are going to be serious about addressing the problem, we have to be serious about divesting from it. We have to stand against the system and the belief that putting people, especially our people, in prisons when they get in trouble and police custody will help us long term or even in the short term. Now, this isn't easy because we don't live in a society where police in prisons aren't necessary. I won't tell you to never call the police or never use the system to seek justice or restitution when you have to, but I ask you to consider when and how you can avoid involving these systems, and under what circumstances does the involvement in this system really have a chance to even be meaningful. Because in most cases, they don't. So you need to be mindful of how these systems really work versus how they pretend to work.
That's why it confuses me why we ever needed anything else to describe the problem or the solution. Like, I know FD and them be using all them big words and getting extra deep in these topics and whatnot, but sometimes the shit ain't that deep. Sometimes it's real simple. You start contextualizing and debating, and next thing you know, you lost the whole plot of what we're talking about. Not only have you taken the claws out and dulled the teeth of a lion, you've replaced the lion with a house cat that makes everyone comfortable. That's why for me it's always been real simple. Fuck the police. We don't need to clean it up. We don't need to change it. We don't need to switch it up so that it's a little more palatable. And I guarantee they're not going to say that if they don't mean it.
Just take it easy. You stumbled onto something here. Maybe we can all benefit from this slight misunderstanding. Now let's go someplace quiet so we can talk this over.
You bastards die just like we do.
The first myth that needs to be dispelled is what the police, and by extension our criminal justice system, is actually here for. The motto, protect and serve, is ubiquitously known as a police creed, but it's not real. Or moreover, it's not written in any police bylaws that they must protect and serve you, the everyday normal citizen. I could cherry pick countless examples of police literally not protecting and serving people when they most need them. I could talk about the police in the Uvalde shooting from a couple of years ago, where they stood idly while a spree shooter murdered 19 children and 2 teachers. Or I could talk about the famous case in New York where police stood behind a door watching a man being attacked with a knife and waited until he and another private citizen subdued the attacker before intervening. Or the landmark child abuse case in 1989, which led to a Supreme Court ruling that says that the police do not have to protect you from harm. A ruling that was upheld again in 2005 after a child murder case. Feel free to look this up. Protect and serve isn't real. The police don't have to protect you from harm unless you're a rich land or property owner, probably. Protection of land and property is probably the true origin of policing as we know it. They were slave catchers protecting the property of slave owners in the South or private businesses in the North. But at least for a time, these entities were often privately funded by the rich who, ironically or unironically, often hired criminals and thugs and miscreants as their police to secure their property. It's not until 1838 when we get our first ever publicly funded police force in Boston as rich shipping business owners convinced the local municipality to take over the cost of their, at the time, private protection of their property as a public good. And suddenly we have taxpayer funded policing as we know it. However, for a long time, the sentiment of fuck the police was much more popular than you might think. For longer than not, in fact, the police were looked at by the general public as nuisances, losers, and snitches, or worse yet, themselves another gang of thugs who just happened to serve the economic or political elites.
I know the police cause you trouble. They cause trouble everywhere. But when you die and go to heaven, you'll find no policeman there.
After 60 plus years of publicly funded police and constant complaints from citizens, the Lexile Committee in New York did the first major probe of police activity in the United States. And after 10,000 pages of testimony from over 700 witnesses, the commission came to the following conclusions.
It appears, therefore, that the police formed a separate and highly privileged class, armed with the authority and the machinery for oppression and punishment, but practically freed themselves from the operation of the criminal law. Many of the members of the force, and even superior officers, have abused the resources of physical power which have been provided for them, and their use only in the cases of necessity in the making of arrests and the restraint of disorder, to gratify personal spite and brutal instincts, and to reduce their victims to a condition of servility. This condition has grown to such an extent that even in the eyes of our foreign-born residents, our institutions have been degraded, and those who have fled from oppression abroad have come here to be doubly oppressed in a professedly free and liberal country. The harm thus done by engendering bitterness and hatred in the minds of multitudes of those people who look upon the police as the highest expression of governmental power.
This sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? It's basically what most black people and pretty much every left-leaning person in earshot has been saying about the police for at least the last 10 years and really longer. So you might be wondering, how did we go from that to where we are now? Why are the police so beloved and trusted now? It's not like they've gotten any better. Why, when we constantly see the abject failure of police, do people look at those instances of failure as anomalies and not an indication of the reality of policing? The answer to this is multifaceted. There's an inherent investment in the authority that permeates American society. A lot of the support for police, especially now, is essentially just a tacit endorsement of racism and anti-blackness. That's why you have people yelling all lives matter to people saying Black Lives Matter, because you know exactly what they're trying to say. The thin blue line flag saw a huge surge in popularity when black people started marching against police brutality. I don't think that's a coincidence. But what I really want to engage in with most is a concept called propaganda, which brings us to an old TV show called Dragnet.
Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
If you look at like early 1900s films or like the 1910s, you run into stuff like the Keystone Cops, Charlie Chaplin. These are people, Buster Keaton, these are people who are not exactly liking the police. And that stuff's going on for a while. And then when they move to television, it's like one of the first big TV shows in the 50s, Jack Webb decides, I'm going to work with the police I'm going to work with the LAPD. I'm going to give them something that is very, quote unquote, authentic.
The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Authenticity is the calling card of cop shows and of propaganda, is this idea that this is the real story. These are real cases.
These are their stories.
Webb gets all of this equipment from the police. He gets to look at real case files. He gets to do all this stuff for free. So all of that becomes way cheaper and thus more profitable. And all he's got to do, all Jack Webb's got to do, is send every script to the LAPD for censorship and approval.
Before Dragnet, the depiction of police in the media mostly aligned with what the Luxau report had to say. Charlie Chaplin, the Keystone Cops, even Bugs Bunny cartoons showed a negative public sentiment toward the police. Dragnet changed that. Dragnet began a legacy of propaganda where people's understanding of policing stopped being what was actually happening in the streets and started being what we see on TV right now. And since most people don't regularly interact with the police, as we said earlier, and when they do, it's often a mostly positive experience, the reality of what police are to those who interact with them the most, aka the poor, is pretty much not understood. And for over half a century, we've been inundated with propaganda, from the cop shows of the 60s and 70s to the action cops of the 80s and 90s to the procedural dramas of the 2000s and beyond. And now even the neo-propaganda of Marvel and Disney, where the heroes are still cops, but they also have superpowers and they make funny jokes.
Hello, girl, kick your ass.
Cop shows contribute to the myth of the thin blue line, which is that aforementioned idea that police are the only protection good law-abiding citizens have from a world of depraved criminals who want nothing but to harm them.
Joe Friday is the main character, and he is just perfect. Like, he never shoots his gun. When he does, it's one shot. He never misses. He's very clinical. He's very cold. He's very calm.
I took the money from people who had it and gave it to those who didn't. What do you think, Sergeant?
What's that?
Was I wrong?
He never gets emotional. He always gets the right guy. He's just perfect. You know, he's like the ideal of what you would want in a detective. Not realistic at all, obviously, and bought and paid for by the LAPD. Then there's also like a lot of thin blue line stuff going on. So they'll talk about how there's crime right around. There's crime every day. It's threatening our city, but good thing we have Mr. Joe Friday. These are real stories. We've changed the names to protect the innocent, but this is what's going on, guys.
Yeah, and
LAPD's got you.
Shows like Cops used to put that reality on in full display. Shows like Law and Order gave us dramatic, heinous examples of the worst things that could happen, but justice is served by the end of the show. And shows like The Wire and We Own the Night present a critical eye toward policing that still eventually reinforces the thin blue line myth. And even outside of that frame, we have shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine and Reno 911 that make cops funny.
Tell me why
ain't nothing but a heartache.
Tell me why
ain't nothing.
And shows like Paw Patrol that hide the gross reality of what police dogs tend to do in real life and their historical connection to slavery.
It is a show that is very like pro-police, obviously. Like the main character is a cop dog. His name is Chase. That's kind of crazy. Let's not leave that unsaid. They keep giving him like gadgets. Like he's got like a drone. He's got like spy gear. He's got all this other stuff. There's like mass surveillance. They know where everything is all the time. Research that I did for the Paw Patrol video, I've done a lot of research on cop stuff and police brutality. That is some of the most horrific shit I've ever read. There were like jugulars broken. People lost their testicles. Like just crazy golf-sized bites being taken out of people's legs for often like not a real, like just in the arrest. Like they're not convicted. There's nothing going on here. Like they might not even be guilty of anything.
Have nothing.
Chan's when you're back, kid. You're under arrest, okay?
All of these shows and movies promote an image of policing and crime that just isn't real and doesn't even make sense most of the time. However, with these images everywhere, with people engaging with the police through TV more than real life, the fiction becomes reality. And we think this is how policing works. And it definitely is not. As I said earlier, the police don't solve many crimes, and they don't have a legal obligation to protect people. And research has consistently found that more police and the amount of police have little to no effect on crime. There is research that indicates that focused deterrent strategies, aka putting more police in high crime neighborhoods, has some effect on reducing crime. But then we have to engage with the whole other body of research that shows the consequence of over-policing poor communities, aka rises in police brutality, the prison population, community disinvestment, you know, the whole problem of the 94 crime bill. I see multiple cop cars whenever I leave my house, and I don't feel any safer. Further, a fraction of the money being spent to over-police high crime areas could be better used to actually funnel resources into those areas with far greater social benefit at a cheaper price. But the reality is these systems aren't meant to benefit society, they're meant to control it. And the thing is, this is not some like left-wing nonsense. This is not some, critical theory extrapolation. This is well understood, constantly reproduced research. The Department of Justice just released a report on the Minneapolis Police Department where George Floyd and many other innocent unarmed people have been murdered. And it showed a clear pattern of repeated abuses and violations that they've known about for decades. But that's not unique. Pretty much anywhere where the DOJ or anyone has investigated the police, they found the exact same things: rampant abuses of power, ingrained racism, and a lack of accountability. And again, this isn't something we're suddenly aware of. 60 plus years of sociological and criminological research on crime has told us over and over that the greatest predictor of crime is poverty and community dysfunction. And thus, the best way to reduce crime is to increase the quality of life in high crime areas.
Law and order have broken down in Detroit, Michigan. Pillage, looting, murder, and arson have nothing to do with civil rights.
John. Well, Mr. President. How are you? I'm fine, thank you, sir. John, you know what I think of you, don't you? I certainly do, Mr. President, and vice versa. I've got to ask you now to act like the good American I believe you to be. I'm going to seriously consider appointing a small group of 7 or 9 tonight to look into the cause of these disorders. I want nothing but competence, and I want nothing but compassion, and I want nothing but patriotism. The Commission will investigate the origins of the disorders in our cities. It will make recommendations to me, to the Congress, to the state governors, to the mayors for measures to prevent or contain such disasters.
The President's Advisory Commission on Civil Disorder warned that race hatred threatened to tear this country apart.
What white Americans have never fully understood, but what could never forget, is that white society is deeply impacted in the ghetto. White institutions created it. White institutions maintain it. And white society condones it.
One of the things that they dispense with, early on, is the idea that you just need to reform police. And, they said, look, no, this is about housing. This is about education. This is about healthcare. This is about media. This is about employment and unemployment. All of the institutions that really relate to life outcomes. And when they kind of walked through the data of the systemic differentiation between how those institutions interacted with Black people and how they interacted with white people, or how they interacted with non-white people, they just came to this holistic understanding, of the problem. And they were saying, well, you can't really talk about policing without also talking about unemployment. And you can't talk about unemployment without talking about education. You can't talk about education without talking about housing.
Among the ingredients of this mixture are pervasive discrimination and segregation in employment, education, housing, which have resulted in the continuing exclusion of a great number from the benefit of economic progress. Black in-migration and white exodus, which have produced the massive and growing concentrations of impoverished in our major cities, creating a growing crisis of deteriorating facilities and services and unmet human needs.
It's the same things we've been saying forever. They found it way back in 1968. The findings were so scathing to the lack of real effort by the government to heal the wounds of racism that the report had to leak out of the relatively progressive Lyndon B. Johnson administration. They didn't want the truth to come out about their own findings. The Kerner Commission report is not new science. You can go to any ghetto in the world, in the entire world, South America, South Africa, South Asia, Eastern Europe. You'll find people in dire straits ripping each other apart for the sake of survival. And in every situation, the same solutions are prescribed: social support, community investment, healthcare, education. Yet, whether it's Joe Biden in 1994 or Joe Biden in 2020, you still see our government officials peddling the lie that we need a better trained and better funded police force to address crime and somehow the failures of policing.
I know most cops and their families are good, decent, honorable people, the vast majority. We have to do better. Give law enforcement the real training they need. Hold them to higher standards. Help them succeed in keeping us safe.
The fallacy of the existence of modern policing is well documented. There will be some books in the description, but just in the last month or so since this video was in production, other big YouTubers like Big Joel, Some More News, Philosophy Tube have made videos detailing lots of new evidence as to why policing is bad. And Skip Intro has a whole series on propaganda that is well worth your time. I appreciate them because the reality is that Black people have been telling this same fucking story to the whole country for several generations now, and it's fallen on deaf ears. It's been in our music, it's been in our politics, it's even been in our family TV shows in the 90s.
But the thing is, officer, this isn't my car.
Get out of the car, Carl.
What?
He's going to tell us to get out of the car.
You watch too much TV, Will.
Get out of the car.
Which is yet another YouTube video you can watch. Sadly, some folks don't take it seriously until a white person tells it to them. So for more specific examples of this, you can check that out or other stuff in the description. Let's move on to the actual prison part of this equation. It's 2010 and I'm in my 4th year teaching, and I'm finally starting to figure out how to survive as a teacher in a tough environment. One of the things I've learned is that you have to appreciate your wins, and one of my wins came in the form of Ben. Ben was the smartest kid I'd ever teach, and he had a slick and snarky sense of humor that made him a pleasure to be around, but also made him a little bit of a slacker, which ended up having him have to retake 10th grade level English as a senior with me. Ben was so smart though that I really couldn't bring myself to make him do sophomore work that was so beneath him. To me, it was more valuable, both to him and me, to do some directed reading. So I gave him Brave New World and The Things They Carried and the autobiography of Malcolm X, stuff that I thought would be challenging for him to learn and fun to talk about with what I low-key saw as a fellow future intellectual. I remember one day he got his SATs back and he said he scored in the 80th percentile and that he was thinking about going to school in Florida, where he was originally from. And I was excited for him because Ben was, one of the good ones. And I know that's not necessarily the most kosher sentiment to have, but when you're teaching in these types of environments, you tend to latch on to kids that you know you can do something for, as opposed to the just larger population of kids that you know you're failing. A week later, literally a week after finding out about his SAT scores, I walk into my homeroom and was informed that Ben had been arrested for armed robbery. They showed me his mugshot online and I couldn't believe my eyes. And I just kind of stared at this mugshot for what felt like hours, but what had to only be 10 minutes because it was homeroom. And I started Googling about the laws in Georgia, which told me that armed robbery had a mandatory minimum of 10 years. And Ben was only 17, which meant he'd spend most of his 20s, if not all of them, behind bars. I remember sitting at my desk for a while, just kind of in this stupor. And then my next class came in and it was time to teach. And then I remember getting up and walking to an empty desk in the front of the classroom and picking it up and throwing it as hard as I could at a nearby window. Comedically, unbeknownst to me, the window was made of like bulletproof glass or some type of reinforced glass, and the desk just kind of bounced off anticlimactically and landed on the floor in a thud. And I stepped outside to collect myself and think about how I may have just lost my job. Shout out to my assistant principal of that time. You know who you are. This sister came through and gathered me up and told me to go home and get myself together, and I did. But the next time I saw Ben, I was visiting him in the county jail. And then I saw him maybe once after that as he was awaiting to get his report date and trying to graduate before he had to go in. And then I didn't see him again until 2023. Man, you look good, bro. How you doing? How you been?
I'm trying. You know what I mean? Day to day in it. You feel me? Just working through the struggles, figuring it out. You know what I'm saying? One step at a time. You know how I go.
That's what's up, man. I'm happy to hear that, man. It's still wild seeing you sometimes.
Man. Imagine looking in the mirror.
That's real. That's real. Man. You know, you don't look like what you've been through, man. Like, I'm happy that, and I hope that speaks to, that the world and life is treating you well in the moment. I'm grateful that the Ben I met in 2023 was mostly the same Ben I met in 2009. But I don't lose sight of the fact that Ben was essentially kidnapped and tortured physically and psychologically for 10 years, most of his 20s. I lament Ben's potential, but I want to be clear. Potential is not a prerequisite for basic humanity. Regardless of what you think about crime, police, and the justice system, consider whether it makes sense that the United States of America, the richest, most powerful country in the world, has only 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. Is America just that much more of a dangerous place, or something just fundamentally wrong with our society? There are a lot of things wrong, actually, and it starts with the ideology of what we're actually accomplishing by putting people in jail in the first place. Concepts of punishment and wrongdoing vary throughout history and across culture. However, Western civilization has a robust history of torture and public shaming for criminals. Shame on you. And those who've transgressed against society or authority.
They fight for what is rightfully theirs. You approve a brutal and illegal act to enforce a political principle, Sam.
Thankfully, this did not last, and new forms of punishment came into being. Kinda. Bray Deschanel did a video on canceling, which I think I've mentioned like multiple times now because it's a really good video, and it brings up this really good point of analysis about French sociologist Michel Foucault. To summarize her summarization of Foucault, there was a time when the public spectacle of punishment and torture was a core aspect of social control. People needed to see the wicked punished for their crimes. I won't call this human nature or anything, but I also won't ignore the fact that that dynamic is still relevant today. I maybe argue this is a product of Western ideology and probably Christianity, but that's a hot take that I can't, or at least won't, substantiate for now. Either way, at a certain point, the public spectacle and horror of torture began to have diminishing returns. Watching another human suffer the gruesome punishment publicly wouldn't instill fear, it would instead instill spite toward the state and sympathy for the punished.
15 or 20 nightsticks could be seen through the gas, flailing at the heads of the marchers. The Negroes cried out as they crowded together for protection, and the whites on the sidelines whooped and cheered.
So eventually, public punishment gave way to private imprisonment. The public could acknowledge that the wicked were being punished, but it didn't have to deal with the visual confirmation of the depravity of what was happening in that punishment, because that punishment was happening behind closed doors. I think this dynamic is incredibly relevant today as 2 million Americans sit in a variety of prisons. The average American has little to no idea of how inhumane and cruel the modern reality of prisons are. While not being drawn and quartered, prisons in America have not been much better than physical torture for the individuals locked away. And there's also emotional and economic torture for the communities and loved ones left behind. Inside prisons, prisoners have to survive extremely substandard living conditions, a lack of security, laughable health care, and constant exploitation.
Going to medical
in prison, like it's a joke. Like, I don't know if you can tell. Hold on. My arm's a little crooked, like right around here.
Yeah.
That's because when I got in a fight in prison, a dude hit me with a pool stick. I blocked it because he was trying to bust me in the head. Broke my arm, but they never set it. They put a cast on it without setting it. So they put it into place for nothing. So they just left it crooked. That is like standard, right? One of the things that always pounded to my head is how they will use inhumane like tactics as a way of punishment. They put me in this square room with a square block in the center, no bed, nothing, no toilet, and left me in there for 3 days. Slid plastic bags through the little slot, so like piss and shit in there and stuff. And so until I finally just caved, I'm like, all right, just do whatever, man. Just do whatever. Get me the fuck out of here. You know what I mean?
And that's like the thing, like I've heard stuff like that before. And it's so wild that that's just a thing that's happening in a civilized nation. You know what I'm saying? Off a drug charge, right? Like that sounds like some medieval shit.
If I had to put a number on it, just within like the overall journey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, I said 8.
You went to 8 different prisons.
8 different 8 different prisons, 2 county jails, 1 transitional center, and 5 different prisons, that'll just land you in different places at different times without you even knowing. You wake up and obviously telling you pack up, you going to such and such. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just a middle of the night process. So it's like I was just moved around from place to place until, you know, I was out and able to move my own.
What goes on that we can't see? Like I remember when COVID hit, you were talking about like, yo, people are just dying in here.
Yeah, COVID was bad. I'm gonna say this. What goes on that you can't see in order to really understand or to start to understand is the lack of security. You know what I'm saying? Like that is what really goes on that you can't see, because every other problem from that, like every other problem is birthed from that. You know what I'm saying? It stems from that. Like that one issue is the deep root of basically every awkward situation in prison, every violent situation in prison, you know, every unwarranted situation. Like it is. You know what I'm saying? You have the lack of empathy from security. When you do have security, you have the whole inmate officer complex. You know, like it's actually illegal to be friends. Like for me to be friends with somebody, like we're human. You get what I'm saying? But like as an officer, you can't tell a coworker or subordinate, whatever, we're friends. Like me and Francois are friends. Like, that's ground termination. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, they want to remove your humanity. You can't have a they do it like there's that legal thing, and then there's like imagine you made friends with somebody inside, and you wake up the next morning, you get transferred. Like you can't have no like that. Like people call prison slavery. That's exactly how that shit goes.
Let's take it further than that. Imagine becoming friends with someone genuinely. You know, you never met this person in your life. You just happen to come across them in prison or whatever. And you're genuinely friends with this person, and then getting out of prison and coming across a statute that states you can't even hang around this person because both of you are ex-felons.
The documentary on the 13th Amendment on Netflix gave new life to our understanding of prisons, examining how prisons share so many structural similarities with chattel slavery.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
For those who don't know, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery except for in the cases of criminals locked in prisons. And after the abolishment of slavery, there was a wave of legal practices in the South that saw Black people arrested for any possible offense and forced to work as a part of their sentences. This practice has not changed, as many prisons today have entire factories committed to manufacturing a variety of things for our consumption, such as when prisoners in New York made masks for the state hospitals during COVID, or to offset costs from the prisons as prisoners and provide labor for a variety of functions in the prison with little to no pay.
The average wage in prisons is around 63 cents per hour. And remember, that's the average.
So that means there are states where prisoners make considerably less.
In Texas, Georgia, Arkansas, and Alabama, prisoners are not paid for their work at all.
However, and this is going to be a theme going forward, the 13th documentary very much misses a lot of important things and warps the reality of this problem in some insidious ways. It hyper-focuses on the private for-profit prison and prison labor when overall, these are relatively small problems.
It's really just a facade. Like the private and public sectors operate across the board. So there's a section of prison that's always going to be privatized. Like you got to pay for phones. You know, here in Indiana, I think it's like $2.10 a phone call. You know, you have to pay. You know, there's people who make money off of the food industry, but that's within any public thing. Like if you look at schools, you're going to see that. Anything in the government, you're going to see there's going to be some kind of private relationship. So there's this emphasis on the corporation. And we don't understand the entire state because it's like, oh, there's these corporations making money. But most prisons are state-run prisons, and prisons are operated at a loss. As in, the more money is paid to uphold prisons than is extracted from it financially, right? So, the state is losing money by paying for prisons. So there's entities who make money around it, but if you actually look at the aggregate of what goes in and what comes out, there's more money lost than there is that, you know, goes in that is made or profited off of.
So what prison does do is it extracts labor from communities that are already marginalized, right? It's a way to take people from their communities and put them into a place where they can either be used for physical labor, or even if they're not, they can use to make profit off of being held there. What it doesn't do is it doesn't bring reform. Prisons are for profit. And private profits made off of government-ran prisons all the time. So it's when the people private prisons, it's not the flex people think it is.
Make no mistake that all prisons, whether private or state or federal run, operate in a fashion that steals from people directly. Again, as I said earlier, all prisons allow for the extraction of labor from prisoners with a Supreme Court-backed rule that does not require them to be compensated at all. And non-compliance with these jobs doesn't mean you get fired. It means you get written up, which means you may get extra time or greater punishment in the form of being sent to a higher security prison where you'll have less freedoms.
Conspicuous, all the way down to, the cotton along the roads, to the prison, it's so conspicuous. It's obvious. You know what I'm saying? You wake up on a bus because you just rode for 4 hours through Georgia, from North Georgia to South Georgia, and then, you wake up and the first thing you see is a whole bunch of trees and woods, and right through the horizon of the sunshine, you're like, what is that? And is that cotton? It's cotton. You feel me? That's some good old Georgia. Cotton. You know what I'm saying? You made it. In the Georgia prison system, you have something that's called a detail, which is essentially a job, a prison job, the detail. You get the detail, and it's whatever it is, whether it be laundry, maintenance, working in the kitchen, things of that nature. It's just your job in the prison. Well, Georgia prisons don't pay for these details.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So essentially it is free labor geared to the cause of repaying your debt to society. We're going to chop it up to that. The slavery is so blatant once you understand the system. You know what I'm saying? Because it's go to work. And if you don't go to work, you're going to get written up. And then if you get written up, you become subjected to being in places that are worse than where you are now, fighting for your life in places where there are less security than where you are now. And we know this.
Right.
As a matter of fact, they employ it. You know what I'm saying? Officers employ, all right, another write-up, and you're going to be closed security, or you're going to be level 5 down, or you're going to be XYZ. You can't hang out there with such and such and such at XYZ prison. Why would you? It's not even about the fact of who's there inmate-wise. It's about the fact that you would weaponize the fact that your coworkers elsewhere care so less that's your threat for me.
There's also an unseen cost for maintaining the type of building and just the land that I'm seeing over in the distance. The grass over here is always cut. The buildings are in disarray, but they're not crumbling. This is paid for by taxpayers. This is paid for by federal budgets, but it's also paid for by the inmates and their families. to the tune of $80 billion. $80 billion in federal funding, taxpayer money, and money straight from prisoners and the prisoners' families. $80 billion that can be spent on all the things the Kerner Commission told us these communities needed way back in 1968. Surely some of you know in Atlanta, we're still dealing with the YSL RICO case for Young Thug and Lil Durk. I don't know which one of these Negroes got arrested, but they talk about Cleveland Avenue. Cleveland Avenue is literally like 5 minutes south from this prison. So consider the community that's being victimized, allegedly victimized by that gang, what that community could do with just $1 billion, let alone 80 billion that we're using to keep buildings like this open. And by the way, that's just the prisons. That's not the police, which is another $130 billion a year. And it's not just tax money, by the way. Chunks of the costs to fund prisons come directly from the actual communities that prisoners come from. A study at the University of Villanova found that mass incarceration has increased poverty in states by 20%. This is because when people, most often men, go to jail, they become an indirect burden on the taxpayer who pays for the prison, but they also become a direct burden on their family who pays money on commissary, pays for phone calls, as well as other resources. But it's bigger than that because these prisoners are also extracted from their local communities and economies. They can't contribute to their families financially. They don't pay into taxes that fund schools or social services, etc. And recognize that while most prisoners may not be in a private prison, the companies that run bail systems, prison phone systems, commissary systems, etc., most definitely are private and contract with the state and federal government to provide those services, which are only partially paid for by taxpayers and must be mostly covered by families of prisoners. And of course, those families are much more likely to be in poverty, meaning they're giving up the little that they have to take care of a person in prison if they can do it at all. And that's just the prison part of prison. That doesn't even get into large costs that are incurred for restitution and bail that many of these families have to eventually pay the bill. Young men like Ben who are extracted from community and their skills and their abilities and their value to that community can no longer serve that community while they're locked inside. It only at best serves the institution that is housing them. And while Ben is inside, it's us, it's his family that pays for him to be there, to be of use to that institution. Yet they call it him paying his debt to society. The 13th Amendment uses a lot of talk about prisons as New Age slavery.
After the collapse of slavery, a new system was born, convict leasing, which was a new form of slavery. And here we are, decades after the collapse of the old Jim Crow, and a new system has been born again in America, a system of mass incarceration that once again strips millions of poor people, overwhelmingly poor people of color, of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement.
And while that definitely holds true in some sense, in talking to some experts and doing a little more research, I kind of find it hard to take that imagery to heart. And that's because despite the fact that the percentage of black people in jail is almost triple the amount of black Americans, that black people are 5 times more likely to be arrested and charged with a crime, the raw reality of America's prison population is that there are just as many, if not more, white people incarcerated as black people. In state prisons, white people make up 32% compared to 34% of black people. White people make up 49% of people in county jails and 57% of people in federal prisons. State prisons do make up a little more than 50% of the prison population, so that does mean that black men still barely outnumber white men in prison. But the reality is that America's total prison population is almost half full with white people, specifically white men. It kind of hurts the analogy of prisons as neo-slavery because I don't know a lot about white slaves at that period of time.
You know, talking about chattel slavery in the United States and transatlantic slave trade was, you know, I mean, at the beginning it was white indentured servants, but overall it was like 100% black African people was slaves, right? Like once it got to scale, you know, there was natives and stuff, but once it got to scale, it was just us, you know? so when you're talking about prison, it's just like, what usually people are doing is looking at disproportionate rates, right? So for instance, in Indiana, like black people only make up 9% of the state, but we make up 34% of prisons, right? Mm-hmm. So the disproportionality is like ridiculous. But 59%, I think, are still just white folks. Coming back to surplus labor, you have a lot of white folks who the capital has no interest in them either. You know, as you continue to automate and do that and send jobs elsewhere, you don't need these people to work at the meat factory that you once did need them to do. You don't need them to do certain jobs anymore. So you just got a bunch of people who has been disinvested from. So of course you're going to have, you know, folks who end up committing crime or getting on drugs or whatever.
It's funny because like the white supremacist talking point is that black people make up 13% of the population and 50% of the crime. And the irony of this talking point is that not only is it not supported by the actual data, but that the data shows that white non-Hispanic people make up around 60% of the population and account for 70% of crime arrests. And white men are 50% of the white population, but men as a whole are 93% of the prison population, and 81% of arrests are for violent crime. And suddenly you realize that the only reason there aren't much larger percentages of white people in jail is due to structural racism. In fact, over the last 20 years, the amount of black people in jail has significantly reduced, while white folks have remained the same.
I think there is a natural feeling to believe that something cannot be operating so unjustly in plain sight. To believe, like, for the system to be as racist and horrific as it is something you need a magnifying glass to parse out. You need, like, statistics. I remember thinking I'd go to court and it's something you got to check the stats. Nah, this was the day I realized, like, oh shit. What it really is was I had cases back to back. So I have my files, all my clients I'm going to arraign back to back, same judge, same prosecutor. I arraign a black guy and he's accused of having like a blunt. They asked for thousands of dollars bail on him. Immediately after, I represent a white guy found with a bag of drugs, obviously a dealer, you know, consent to release. Didn't even add consent. And that's always, listen to me, that has always been the case for my white clients. When I represent a white person, I might as well close my ears and arraignments because I'm not going to have to make a case.
And this reality presents a complex challenge to prison abolition and criminal justice reform movements. I generally don't know if engaging more with the overwhelming whiteness of our prisons would give more fuel to the fire of abolition and criminal justice reform or less. I don't want to engage in any oppression Olympic stuff, but I have done social work in rural areas, and for anyone who has tried to do any type of social good in Trump towns, you'll find a unique challenge where these folks will actively work against their best interests for the sake of upholding a system of inequality that they don't fully benefit from.
I had breast cancer last year, so I was very happy to have my insurance. I didn't realize that the government was subsidizing my health insurance.
One of Bobby's complaints about the program is that it has been linked to a president she strongly dislikes.
And I absolutely detest hearing the words Obamacare.
Yeah.
Detest it.
Racial resentment and poor political education makes them liabilities to themselves as their own governments cut their services and their own favorite corporations and billionaires disinvest from their communities and exploit them directly. Their sons fill prisons and struggle with addiction while their local economies die and health crises ravage their communities. All while they rally behind the anti-woke virus or whatever the fuck Ron DeSantis calls it.
Woke, 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 woke.
So that they're focused more on ending critical race theory and keeping trans women out of women's bathrooms, and the fact that their communities are literally rotting and nobody seems to care. White America as a whole should have a vested self-interest in dismantling the prison industrial complex just as much, if not more, than people of color. And whenever we speak of the problem of American prisons, we should see a white face for every black face. But we don't, do we?
White folks, a lot of times in these conversations, become collateral damage as if the whole prison is black and brown.
Right.
You know, right. And no one else ever even goes. And it's just not true. Like poverty, if we care, and my thing is, it's not about caping for white people. I don't even talk to them, but I'm just saying, like, it's just, if we care about poverty, then we need to care about poverty. You can't like section it off, right? If you care about prisons, you need to care about prisons. You can't section it off.
Right.
So yeah, it's a black issue because we are disproportionately impacted by it, but it's a problem, period. If you're putting people in cages like that, if people are in poverty when there's all this wealth created, if you claim to be any kind of leftist, which this channel speaks to, then that's a problem regardless. But it also, on the flip side, isn't a reason to say race doesn't matter.
Right.
Or because like you said, it needs the blackface.
Right.
To justify everything else.
Yeah.
You know, it needs to be seen as a problem that's only us, so it can do it to everyone. It needs that front, you know, to do the rest of the stuff.
The moderate and liberal point of view on these problems inherently believes that these systems work and that these problems that I'm talking about within the system only require tweaks. They would be perfectly fine with the 2 million plus prisoners being behind bars as long as they were proportional to the normal population, even if that means increasing the white population of prisoners. What has to be acknowledged is that the awful outcomes of the prison industrial complex, from the police precinct to the prison yard, those problems are not bugs or glitches, they're features of this system. They are the system working exactly as it's designed. I want to end on like talking about Pendleton.
Yeah.
And talking around, just getting back to that counterinsurgency, revolutionary aspect, what that story and documentary was meant to do and why it's important for people to like not just know that specific thing, but understand how that thing exists within like the greater context of the problem.
January 1st, 1985. Me and my co-defendant, John Cole, we were where we were supposed to be, which was on that lockup unit at that time, going to a CAB hearing. And there was a disturbance on the lockup unit. The first thing we noticed was the smell of mace. And then that I had already served time on the lockup unit, I knew what that meant, especially when the curtain was pulled. I knew that there was some form of terrorism going on.
There was an active approach inside prisons started by the FBI to identify, you know, people who were potentially insurgent. February 1st, 1985, there was an uprising at Pendleton Correctional Facility, what at the time was known as Indiana Reformatory. And the uprising was started by the prison guards. So there was a inmate by the name of Lincoln Love, aka Lokmar. He was on the maximum restraint unit. On that day, the guard that usually worked that unit, the guard who ran that unit, just wasn't there. It had been searched, and they targeted this one particular inmate, Lincoln Love, who had been an organizer inside the prison, who was a jailhouse lawyer, who had gotten, you know, tens of people out of prison, who always looked out and was organizing people within the prison, which is what they had been doing prior to this day.
These walls are funny. First you hate them, and you get used to them. Enough time passes, you get so you depend on them. That's institutionalized.
In her book, Golden Gulag, geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore presents what I think is the most compelling explanation of the core of why our prison system is so fundamentally awful. And I'm resisting saying broken because when you start to critique what the system actually does and how it fits into the overall scope of capitalism, you recognize that it's not broken, it's actually a well-oiled machine. She did a historical analysis on the state of California, which still has one of the highest prison populations per capita in the country, and she concluded that looking at the problem of prisons and jails just as an exploitative element of slave labor was missing the point. The truth is that economically, prisons are not all that profitable and haven't been pursuing profit pretty much this entire time. The reality from her perspective is that prisons represent a useful and versatile tool to manage capitalism's ongoing challenges of excess labor, land, and resources, and does it in a way that provides multiple benefits to the system as a whole, including population control and galvanizing political ideologies for or against certain populations, and to a lesser extent, providing some profit that can be made off of the labor of prisoners. The short version is that after industrialization and going into the 1970s, America developed an excess labor problem and solved that problem with crime and prisons. In the 70s, we begin to see the slow but quickly accelerating erosion of American manufacturing industry. We begin to truly enter late-stage capitalism in the West as America, once a producer of goods, had finally shifted so much wealth and power to capitalists that the capitalists were able to create situations where they could utilize cheap labor in developing nations, cutting millions of Americans out of the capitalist equation, aka they took our jobs. When I say they, I don't mean immigrants, I mean corporations that shipped those jobs to countries that had populations that didn't even have to immigrate to this country to take the job in the first place. Capitalism always requires surplus labor with which to control the labor market and keep wages down, but too much surplus labor, especially with traditionally marginalized groups, that requires some modifications or things start to get dicey. To address that diciness and turn a profit, Gilmore argues that in California, prisons were sold as economic engines for small towns. It almost sounded like people were pitching amusement parks or casinos.
Well, sir, there's nothing on earth like a genuine, bona fide, electrified six-car prison.
These towns would be promised jobs and investment. There was also the added benefit of creating taxable land ownership for the state and counties where the prisons would be built. The catch is, whatever economic value that was to be made had to come from funneling prisoners into those prisons, which set the ground for perverse social and political policies that would explode California's prison population well before the '94 crime bill.
Opposition to prison development was more easily managed by pro-prison forces. Aided by the CDCs, the California Department of Corrections, persuasive prospectuses promising jobs and other amenities. Those that were eventually successful in having prisons sited in their vicinity had well-organized delegations with few objections to or demands on the CDC's proposal. They also had large landlords willing to sell nearby surplus acres that the town could incorporate in order to reap the imagined harvest of state subventions, sales tax, and other incomes.
So this looks like a conspiracy, but I hesitate to call it that. While there have been several very real conspiracies against black people in this country, such as the Tuskegee experiment or COINTELPRO, but this seems more like natural responses to capitalism that they just kind of figured out in the process. The racism creates the social conditions create crime, and somebody sees that and says, hey, we can profit off that crime, not just through building prisons and making money off prisoners, but also doing a little population control, because these criminals, they're not just criminals, they're dangerous potential revolutionaries. That may seem like a reach if you don't know the history of how many gangs were formed and even utilized by revolutionary actors throughout history, not just in America, but worldwide. The documentary, The Bastards of the Party, is an unsung classic in that genre, likely lesser known because of its more radical pro-black vibes as opposed to the sensational and exploitative nature of most street gang documentaries. It first illustrates how the loss of skilled labor options precipitated a growth in street gangs.
For 400 years, black labor built the United States. All of a sudden, it's no longer needed. So sorry. I mean, there's something different about being poor in LA than there is anywhere up in the world. You're right up against it. It's all there in front of you, and you can't have any.
Street gangs are not a new phenomenon, but it used to be that a young man would be in a gang as a kid and then grow up and get a job. But when those jobs disappeared, the gangs did not. In fact, they took on new meaning and purpose, and many of those meanings and purposes were not so great for the community the gangs were in. The resulting rises in poverty and crime creates lots of bodies to fill those jails in those rural prisons, but it also serves to manage that population that might otherwise be a threat, not just at the street crime level, but in a revolutionary sense. People don't just wake up one morning and decide to join a gang and break in houses or sell drugs. A lot of that requires a process of alienation and dehumanization, often through the social exclusion and dysfunction that poverty causes.
As those jobs start disappearing in these, quote unquote, urban neighborhoods in the hood, that doesn't exist. So some people turn to the black market, right? So the state says, we don't have any jobs for these people. And not just, we don't have any use for these people. But we can't have them on the street. In Marxism, we call this a surplus labor. Right. So we have a surplus labor force that we ain't got no jobs for them. So where are we going to put them?
One thing as a convict, everybody realizes you always have a choice. The choice might be fucked, but you always have a choice, right? You know what I mean? Like, for example, I go back to when I was selling dope and I was on the streets and stuff like that. I had a choice. I could be homeless and not sell dope, or I could sell dope and not be homeless, right? I had a choice. I just chose to sell dope. You know what I mean? Now, does that mean I think I should have been thrown in prison for it? No. No, that wasn't the answer. Like, I needed economic help. I needed support. I needed housing. I needed things like that. When I went to prison, it was like a high school reunion, literally. Like, everybody who had dipped out and disappeared, and we know what happened to them, they're in prison. You know what I mean? So when I went to prison, at least the state prison, then it was I like saw all these people from high school. I was like, oh shit, that's where you went to.
Both my parents are college educated. My daddy is an architect. My mommy is a CPA. Because of that, it was never a question whether or not I was going to school, going to college. I knew that was a part of the natural order of things. There's a difference between being broke and being structurally like impoverished. At the end of the day, even if I have $0 to my name, I'm from a socioeconomic class, a walk in life where I have friends and people that I could even get money from. You know what I mean? I have different opportunities and mobility. And that's a certain different level of privilege. So it's like, yeah, sure, I don't steal. It's easy for me to be like, oh yeah, I wouldn't steal, or I'm not going to do this, or whatever it is. I only don't have to do what my circumstances don't require me to have to consider.
Essentially, when people grow up in a society that hates and demonizes them for their race or ethnicity or just being poor, those people are more likely to feel a part and less beholden to that society, and thus a little less likely to follow the rules and laws of that society. So in practice, this mostly just looks like street crime. But in theory, it has always been society's rejects and outsiders, the poor and the oppressed, regardless of race or gender or religion or creed, that have been most apt to engage in radical action against the status quo.
And we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution. Right.
This is the real danger of crime that our current system is hyper-focused on, that doesn't often get talked about. Tookie Williams and Sonny Carson and Larry Hoover, these were notable gang leaders who were in prison for violent crimes, but at the same time, they're also Black men who had the capacity to galvanize and organize hundreds and thousands of Black youth under one cause and one banner with extreme loyalty. Back in the 60s, the Panthers sought and worked to unify and recruit from street gangs for this very reason, because they recognized that the greatest potential for revolution would reside in the untapped potential of those people, and our justice system has that same understanding.
First started, we had a police alert patrol, and we would patrol the community. If we saw the police brutalize anyone, we would put an end to this. Usually the police wouldn't brutalize anyone if we were on hand because we were armed. And if the police arrested the individual, we'd follow him to the jail and bail the individual out, whether he was a Panther or not. And we would gain many recruits like this. So therefore, the community started to say that, well, these people are really concerned about our welfare.
This video is coming out in August, which is a significant month in the realm of radical and revolutionary action. And in those radical circles, August is referred to as Black August. Black August seeks to commemorate the unquantifiable amount of political prisoners locked up in America and worldwide. And it was created to honor the death of one of America's most influential political prisoners and gang leaders, George Jackson.
For 10 years, Jackson read and wrote constantly. Prison was his school. His letters were collected and published in a book. For him, the oppression and humiliation, the frustration and the violence of the prison system were but a reflection of what it was like to be a black man outside in American society. Prison made George Jackson a revolutionary. Violence he saw as the only instrument of change. Overnight, his letters made him an idol of the left and a respected literary figure.
Jackson embodies what capitalists fear about not just prisoners, but the unchecked surplus labor of disaffected people. Jackson was a petty criminal in California before being arrested for armed robbery of a gas station for $70. For this crime, he was sentenced to, and I kid you not, an indeterminate sentence of 1 to 99 years in prison.
A 1 to life. A term they called for 1 to life, where I could have done 1 year and been released. I've done 10. That's more time than anybody in the state has ever done on a 1 to life.
However, a few years into his sentence, Jackson found Lenin and Fanon and Marx, etc., and much like a Malcolm X before him and countless people since then, he had a political awakening and began to organize with other prisoners inside of the prisons in response to the inhumane and brutal treatment of the prison guards that he was receiving. And because he did this, Jackson became feared and targeted in prison. Eventually, he was charged and convicted with the murder of a prison guard that would have him put on death row. A collection of letters he wrote regarding his experiences and beliefs culminated into Soledad Brother, a bestseller that brought him attention and acclaim. His work was lauded by academics and revolutionaries alike. He even allegedly exchanged love letters with Angela Davis. In fact, the story of Angela Davis and her connection to Jackson and Jackson's brother is legit worthy of a Spike Lee film. And getting back to Throwing Shade at the 13th documentary, they spend a short section talking about the criminal trial that Davis underwent as a result of her connection to Jackson, but make no mention of the details or even mention Jackson's name or the other co-defendants involved in the case. And it's almost as if they don't want to bring attention to those radical politics that Jackson represented.
Story again, and the system tried to put the sister on trial, and the sister said, no, we putting you on trial. She came in like this, and she devastated the prosecution.
Davis was put on trial because she owned guns that were used in an armed insurrection at a California courthouse by George Jackson's brother, Jonathan Jackson, an insurrection that ended in a police shootout that saw Jonathan and several others killed, including a judge. Jackson himself was eventually killed in an alleged prison escape less than a year later, but his work resonated after his death, and his next book, Blood in My Eyes, cemented him as a centerpiece for revolutionary politics and prison abolition.
So yeah, he gets assassinated, and in August, that's again why we honor it in August, and then that next month is when Attica happens, which again goes back to George Jackson. So I'm throwing out all those references to say, George Jackson is like the core of a lot of either people or moments in Black history that we even know about. The quote I read you earlier about destroying a prison, that I believe that was in Blood in My Eyes.
Yeah.
So it's like George Jackson is central to our understanding of prisons, to Black August, obviously, because it was a commemoration that started with his people. You know, he's central to a lot of revolutionary theory. Some people who even theory on fascism, central to that. You know, and he was also even considered an honorary Black Panther, like inside the prison as well. So he's connected to all these different things, and he did it all from his own cell.
It's important to remember that prison abolition didn't start with academics and petite bourgeois Negroes. It started in the prisons. Jackson may have entered prison a petty thief, but he found politics in the process. And this is a pattern we've seen before, both in terms of developing politically, but also in terms of being persecuted. This story is repeated multiple times, including the Pendleton 2, of which Tooblack has released a documentary on after they were charged with insurrections and given ridiculous amounts of prison time for what amounted to self-defense under a racist and violent institution. But recognize that many past and current political prisoners like Mumia Abu-Jamal and numerous members of the Black Panther Party of the 1960s, including Huey P. Newton and Fred Hampton, as well as civil rights leaders before and after him, such as Martin Luther King and John Lewis, were targeted and arrested by police and put in prisons in the middle of political movements. Hell, even Dr. Dre didn't want to make the song Fuck the Police because he was on a prison release program and didn't want retaliation from the prison guards. This system has always been used to target would-be agitators.
I talk about teeth a lot, right? It is the fascist teeth, right? It is the way to force people into submission. If you're organizing politically and you are a political dissident, what are they going to do, right? They're going to send the police after you, which are fascists, and then they throw you into the prison as a consequence, where then people will not pay attention, for example, if you die. And even if you don't die, you will sit there for years rotting away because they don't want you speaking up. They need to have the whip. They need to have the way to inflict pain and terror upon people. Like for even like what you said, this might be too much, but like you not want to speak on certain things because you're scared of facing consequences of doing that, even though your First Amendment rights is supposed to protect you. You know how far that really goes if you push hard enough.
Back to Golden Gulag, Gilmore tells the story of Gilbert Jones, a former gang leader who, with the help of activists, began an organizing initiative that was seeking to create truces and unification between street gangs in South Central Los Angeles for the purpose of resisting police brutality and corrupt courts. As this movement gained steam, Jones was arrested for a $10 armed robbery. Gilmore writes,
"The state relocated Gilbert's case from Compton, where a seating Black jury is quite easy, to the Long Beach courtroom of an anti-gang judge, Marvin Doolittle. Despite the testimony of numerous witnesses who were there with him at the time of the robbery, the jury found Gilbert guilty. And despite further testimony at the sentencing hearing from the former governor Jerry Brown, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and others concerning his peacemaking achievements, the judge bound the young man over to the custody of the California Department of Corrections to serve 7 years for a $10 robbery.
You may be thinking that all of this horrifying, counter-revolutionary, oppressive tactics that I'm talking about are relics of a bygone era, that modern police and courts wouldn't be so bold to do such things today, but you'll be mistaken. We've seen the arrest, detainment, and in some cases, mysterious disappearances of protesters over the last few years. But more blatant and in-your-face stuff is still happening right now here in Atlanta. For longtime viewers, you know that I have taken a vested interest in bringing attention to Atlanta's Cop City Resistance Project. Cop City is a project that seeks to take $90 million, including $60 million of taxpayer money, to build a militarized police training facility in a Black working class community, while also tearing down a significant force referred to as Atlanta's lungs. And I had known about this situation for almost a year before deciding to talk about it on my platform. But what spurred me to say something on my channel, where I usually talk about Black movies and like the manosphere, was the arrest of 5 young people that were peacefully occupying the forest in December of 2022.
Federal agents flushed 5 people out of the wooded site due to be cleared to build the facility. The 5 were then charged with domestic terrorism.
They were not involved in endangering anybody. They were sitting passively in trees trying to express a political position.
Domestic terrorism for protesting. Now, since then, there has been an escalation in tactics and challenges to this project. So there have been other protesters also charged with domestic terrorism, where it seems at least somewhat reasonable according to these bullshit laws. But the first 5 people charged in December were charged with terrorism because of alleged vandalism and trespassing. Worse yet, just a few weeks ago, a nonprofit that raises money for the legal fees for protesters was raided by an armed SWAT team. A SWAT team was used to penetrate this house in the middle of a nice neighborhood on the east side of Atlanta, where I literally cannot afford to buy a house at.
Marlon Kautz, Adele McClain, and Savannah Patterson were charged with 1 count each of money laundering and charity fraud. Warrants allege the 3 were, quote, misleading contributors to fund the actions in part of Defend the Atlanta Forest, a group classified by the United States Department of Homeland Security as domestic violent extremists. As proof of money laundering, the warrants cite reimbursements from April 2021 to March of this year that total less than $7,000 and were for forest cleanup, totes, COVID rapid tests, media, and yard signs. The Atlanta Solidarity Fund issued a statement that it's existed for 7 years, quote, with the sole purpose of providing resources to protesters experiencing repression.
They were arrested and charged with financial crimes. Ask yourself if you've ever heard of a SWAT team being used to arrest bankers. Quick addendum here to update the ongoing escalation of legal violence against this resistance movement. 61 individuals were given RICO charges related to community organizing against the Stop Cop City movement. Here is a literal quote from the district attorney that illustrates how bogus these charges are.
When you allege a conspiracy to commit racketeering, there's no requirement under Georgia law that they know each other. The whole purpose of the Georgia racketeering law is that they're all working in some way, shape, or form towards the same goal, and they formed a conspiracy to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that every person has to talk to every single person. All you have to do is commit one overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy with the others, and then you can be guilty of racketeering. So that's why, is because it's a large case, and so if you want to tie everybody together and they're all trying to do the same thing, racketeering is the appropriate charge.
By this logic, anyone who has done anything against this project can be charged with racketeering. This is an extremely scary and dangerous precedent being enacted that could impact any form of organized protest and resistance in this country, whether it be strikes, civil disobedience, boycotts, canvassing, etc. It's so bad that 2 district attorneys in DeKalb County recused themselves from being a part of the prosecution because even they know what's up. I don't know if there's better evidence to prove the point that I'm trying to make here. This isn't happening in Alabama or Texas or New York or LA or Chicago or some other place known for silencing dissent and marginalized voices or this type of violence. This is happening in Atlanta, Georgia, Wakanda, Black Mecca, the home of Martin Luther King, John Lewis, the city too busy to hate, where our Democratic Morehouse graduate mayor is working with Republicans to push this unpopular and outright terrifying project through.
The Public Safety Training Center will be a vital piece of infrastructure that will serve the training needs of our fire and police departments and be a true community asset to our residents. Today, I am pleased to report that we have reached an agreement with DeKalb County to issue the construction permits and begin to move the project forward.
I have a genuine fear for my own safety as I'm making this video. I've made myself visible in a way talking up this issue, and these institutions have made it clear that they don't have an issue with weaponizing the justice system against dissenters like me, which is why, for those of you ops watching, I want to be clear, I'm just an entertainer. I'm a loudmouth grad school dropout talking shit on YouTube. My last video was literally about making videos on YouTube, and the one before that was about anime. Don't pay me any mind. Like, share, and subscribe. Join my Patreon. Buy a t-shirt. Joe Biden 2024. I joke, but the reality is I'm genuinely afraid. I struggle because on some level, I feel like maybe this is ego and arrogance and paranoia, and I literally am just a YouTuber who should not have any type of attention or effect on these large systems where they target me. But the fact is, I'm supposed to be afraid. When the police raid nonprofits, when they shoot protesters and charge peaceful protesters with domestic terrorism, that is their goal. They want to instill fear in people who might resist. That is not a bug of this system. It's a feature. The Pendleton 2 documentary starts off with this conversation about what happened to George Floyd. Specifically, the director is asking, what would he have done if he was there?
And instantly I was reminded of how dangerous this country is for people who look like me. But then I thought about the other people who happen to be in the unfortunate position of having to stand there and watch as a man dies.
Because when you look at that George Floyd tape, of course you see the police officer standing on George Floyd's neck. But the thing that's often forgotten about is that this entire scene is witnessed by a crowd of people yelling and screaming to hopefully save George Floyd's life. I've often conversed with others and thought to myself about what is the reality where the people filming George Floyd's murder put the phones down and stepped in to intervene. What froze them there? What would they be risking if they stood up to those officers, even as they witnessed them doing something that they clearly shouldn't have been doing? What would I have done in that situation? I can talk a good game behind this camera. In this little pocket universe, I control everything that happens. But would I have done any differently than they did? I have a wife and kids at home. Would I have risked my life or livelihood to save another? People can talk a good game in comment sections and on videos and in reports after the fact, but I know I'm not the only one to not really know deep down inside whether my response to that situation would have been any different. And it's one of the reasons why I don't talk too greasy behind the safety of this camera. The reality is the badge and the gun in that situation imbues in us a sense of fear to not do the right thing, even when it's obvious what the right thing is. It takes a whole different mindset and disposition to be about that action. A mindset and disposition that often results in getting targeted. Because the fear of the consequences of taking action, of doing what's right, of seeking justice, that is a fundamental function of the police and their presence. It is meant to make us think twice, whether they'll kill you and get away with it, or lock you up after a sham trial, or have a SWAT team breaking down your door. All those things send a message. So we really need to start sending one back. To those people who are willing to risk their safety and livelihood to protest and take action against these systems legally and non-violently, of course, we need to show those folks that if and when they do get targeted by these systems, that we will at least have their backs. That is the point of Black August. And in those cases where they do go away, we won't forget about them, and we will continue to fight for their freedom and fight against this system. That's the least we can do.
So I could get into deep political theory, but on a real basic level, political prisoners are that because they are punished not just for what they did, but to send a message to everyone else. So if slavery ever did have a decent analogy here, it's just very similar. When you punish the slave who ran away or rose up against, and you make sure that there's a public display of that so everybody else can see what happens when you do that, right? Yeah. So if you can't have that person's back, if we can't have their back, then that sends a message to any of us that when we do choose to rise up, that ain't nobody gonna be there for us. So people probably less likely to turn up, right? But if you know when you turn up, even if all of us aren't willing to go that far, that at least people are gonna have your back. You know, you'll have way more people willing to commit themselves to struggle. But if it's just like, yo, this happens and nobody cares, then people aren't going to commit themselves to struggle, because struggle's not an individualistic thing. They committed themselves to struggle because they were in a cohort of people who all loved each other and took care of each other. And that's important to emphasize. But if we can't have their backs, what does that say about any of the shit we're kicking? Yeah. Because the fact that we can even have this conversation is a product of the struggles that happened prior. Even if some things got co-opted, even if some people went to prison, even if some people got killed, the only reason we can have this conversation is because people were willing to struggle, or we wouldn't even be able to do this in public. Because there was a time where quite literally this was death.
So we're going to see about Bobby, regardless of what these people think we should do. Because school is not important and work is not important. Nothing's more important than stopping fascism, because fascism will stop us all.
So in the description of this video will be a list of causes, petitions, documentaries, and further opportunities for educating yourself on the problems of policing and prisons, including a place to donate to support the ongoing anti-Cop City movement, as well as a link to the aforementioned Pendleton 2 documentary, co-directed by my guest Tooblack. That one can be found on the Signified B-Sides channel, along with more information on how you can support the Pendleton 2. Please take a little time to engage in supporting these causes, because the vastness of this problem I couldn't even begin to describe or fully enumerate in a YouTube video, but the goal was for this to be a jumping point for all of you watching. Because there are small wins being had on the regular. Cities across the country are piloting community policing efforts, eliminating cash bail, and investing in communities and infrastructure for at-risk neighborhoods. Even Republicans want to defund the FBI, not for the right reasons, but a win is a win. But still, it mustn't be lost what John has been saying this whole time. In 2020, the concept of defunding the police was at its most popular level ever and gaining steam. And then the concept of defunding the police turned into reforming the police, which literally turned into funding the police and resulted in increases in police budgets nationwide since 2020. It was a radical concept that was co-opted. And don't get me wrong, we all knew that was likely gonna happen, but it does hurt a bit and mean something that these messages and these ideas that are created in these leftist spaces are so easily subsumed into the status quo, partly because we do part of that work for them. We don't want to say the thing in its most clear and unassailable and purest form. It happened to defund the police. It happened to Black Lives Matter. It happened to the word woke. So we're gonna take a cue from my boy John, and even fucking Ice Cube from that era before he sold out and was appearing on Tucker Carlson shows, along with a legacy of Black people suffering under these systems who gave him the idea for that in the first place, and call it what it is. It's not reform the police. It's not defund the police. It's not abolish the police. It's fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad cause I'm brown. And that's gonna be really hard for them to water down. And if folks think that's too abrasive, that's kind of the point. And that's pretty much it, except for the fact that I have to take a moment to talk about this video sponsor, and the only reason why a video like this probably could be made, at least for me, my streaming service, Nebula. A lot of work went into this video. A lot of risk went into this video, to be honest. And both of those things are only worth it or only feasible because of my streaming service, Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service where a lot of different types of creators, including YouTubers like myself, came together to basically build our own independent streaming platform. Together, we make up something that I like to describe as the Discovery Channel, but for YouTube, minus all of the really awful reality TV shows that Discovery Channel shows these days. That means on Nebula, you'll get lots of social political content like the stuff I'm bringing you, as well as media analysis, history, video games, science, some of the coolest things that are being done independently on YouTube are being done better on Nebula, minus commercials, minus ad reads like this one, and without the challenges that come with creating on YouTube, such as worrying if videos like this might get demonetized because corporations won't want to play their ads over a video that is this critical of America's policing system, or worrying about if some song or sound effect that you use is going to get a copyright flag and make it so a video that you worked weeks or even months on suddenly can't make you any money. On top of getting access to director's cut versions of the content you like watching, you also get direct access to the content creators where they can teach you about their creative process through Nebula classes. On Nebula classes, you'll have Nebula creators and other creators basically showing you the back end on how we develop concepts. For example, Foreign Man in a Foreign Lands video on storytelling, as well as plenty others explaining the content creation process. Lastly, for the month of September, Nebula is offering lifetime memberships for $300. Now, obviously this isn't for everyone, but for those of you who have the capacity and are looking to support creators like myself, this is the best way to make that happen. Nebula is making a renewed focus on original content. And for this content, we not only want to make stuff that really just can't exist on YouTube, we also want to go bigger and better. We're talking about movies and full-on documentaries. I myself am already in the planning stages for my own Nebula original that's going to be way bigger than anything I've done on YouTube. You get access to original content from some of your favorite creators that can't be seen anywhere else. And more importantly, you get to help me keep making the type of stuff that I want to make without worrying about the algorithm and all these other aspects of the creative process here on YouTube. You get all of that by clicking the link in the description and using my sign-up code FDSignifier. I'm so grateful to the people at Nebula for sponsoring this video. I appreciate all of you for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.
Like, they gonna hate dusting off my shit, like, okay. And this is extortion, nigga. Hey, dusting off my shit, like, gonna, hey, dusting off my, like, Craig gonna, yeah, dusting off my shit, like, Craig gonna, hey, this extortion, nigga. Okay, check. Yeah, okay, keep that bingo on me when I'm rolling slowly through a side of shit where I know they don't know me. Can't be playing, get caught slipping, get left laying. Fuck a speed limit, I don't see limits, I don't need limits. My OGs in this, they like nigga kill them. Yeah, God, culture freedom, Atlanta East like peace, like breathing in these streets like a demon, like all 8 billion can get it. Give me a reason. Look, I ain't had a good day in a fucking minute. Got me back in it, then it's the minute, then it's the business. It's that organic fire. Nigga, you trippin', nigga. Okay, look, creep with me as I crawl through the hood. Blacks, maniacs, insanes, it's all good. Where every nigga around really wish you would, and I respect it if you did, but you should. Okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on the bitch, what's happening? Okay, hey look, dusting off my shit like Craig on the bitch, what's happening? Yeah, okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on the bitch, what's happening? Yeah, okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on the bitch, what's happening? Okay, it's hard to twist up, trying not to lift your wrists up. Let me take this shit off for these niggas want pictures. Bitches want my babies, lawyers want my cases. Mama want my safety, can't convince her I ain't crazy. Look, fuck who you loving, bitch, not tell me who you screwing. Get this nut off, I had you vibing like the Bruins. Boston, not in Boston, ice it, price it. The pussy don't know me, how the fuck you don't like me? Look, download the blick, upload the clip, point, click, delete. The police you where that fuck shit be. Look, greet ya, beat ya, sleep ya like Javante. Machine gun punches, bitch, Kelly with the gunpay. Champion 2 day, fuck 1 day, fuck someday. My bitch like bitches, thank God for last Sunday. 2 of them on my dick like cherries on a Sunday. And I was on time for him like Kanye. Okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on a bitch, what's happening? Okay, hey look, dusting off my shit like Craig on a bitch, what's happening? Yeah, okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on a bitch, what's happening? Yeah, okay, dusting off my shit like Craig on a bitch, what's happening? Okay, God, culture freedom, Atlanta East like peace, like peace, like God, culture freedom, Atlanta East like peace, like peace, like God, culture freedom, Atlanta East. peace like, peace like peace like, peace like God, culture freedom, Atlanta East like, peace like peace like, peace like, peace like.